40,000 to bring that number.
We have to resume debate. The honourable member for Battle River Crowfoot.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. You know, here we are debating the Economic Statement Implementation Act, following a throne speech after prorogation. But before I get into the substance of my speech, I think it's important to put on the record again that the context of this debate is taking place about 600 days since the last federal budget. Madam Speaker, 600 days since Canadians had a fulsome view of the finances of our nation. And certainly I think that reality should cause many to pause and question the objectives and agenda of the federal government, and certainly we all understand the unprecedented times that we face. However, provinces, other jurisdictions, cities have all been able to figure out how to present, approve, and manage the budgetary process. Yet here we are 600 days, and Conservatives certainly were calling for fulsome economic details the entire way, but we have not got those, and that is incredibly troubling. So that's the context, the 30,000-foot view that we are in terms of the bill that we are debating before us, Bill C-14. You know, Madam Speaker, I spent a lot of time on the phone last night with constituents, and the Liberals are very, very quick to brag about the way that they've handled this crisis, the $400 billion. In fact, the Associate Minister and Parliamentary Secretary just prior to this was bragging about how much money they've spent. But certainly one has to consider not just the dollars that are spent, but one has to consider how effectively those dollars are being spent, what the result is. You know, certainly when any Canadian goes shopping, they don't simply look at who can spend the most. They look at the value for the dollars that they're being spent. That's just part of simple budgeting, which speaks to my initial point. And certainly on this side of the House, we have great concern about the effectiveness of some of these dollars spent. Supports have been needed, and I know the Liberals are quick to say, "Oh, Conservatives wouldn't have done all this," and you know, we've been collaborative throughout the entire process, but critical at the same time, because there is much to be critical of. Because when you look at the results for what's been spent, certainly there's some serious questions, and that's what I heard from constituents last night, and to bring together the speech that I did a couple of days ago and what we're discussing today, specifically the economic realities that my constituency is facing. You know, I spoke to a rancher in a small community in my constituency, and you know, almost in tears on the phone, and she said, "Share with the Prime Minister, share with the Liberals this." So I'm going to quote her. "Look me in the eye and tell me there's no future for my kids in Alberta." That's a quote, Madam Speaker. We were talking about the economic circumstances of Alberta, Alberta's place in the Federation, of which it's heartbreaking, the number of people that I speak to who think that Alberta might be better off alone. And I know that members opposite will want to play politics with that issue, but I'll tell you, as a member of Canada's National Parliament, a proud Canadian, to hear so many that feel like Canada has given up on them and that they feel like they have no choice. That's tragic, and that should cause all in national leadership to pause. And certainly that relates directly to what we're talking about here today. You know, I also got an email that sums up quite a few of the other calls that I got last night, and I won't read it all, partly because it's not overly parliamentary in terms of the language. But in the context of the devastating circumstances around Keystone, the energy sector, the economy, the service sector being pummeled, hotels being closed, all of these things are seeing a level of tragedy that is unbelievable. Talking about the mental health effects specifically, and in this case, 2 parents from her son's class saw no hope and committed suicide. Madam Speaker, I read that into the record because it provides the context on how important it is to get this right. You know, there's a whole host of issues that are addressed in this bill, and quite frankly, there's some things that need to be addressed. Some of it is fixing some of the issues with previous legislation that had been brought forward. Some of the issues were identified early, but we're now only fixing. Some of it are promises that were made in the throne speech that are now being attempted to be actualized, and some, like's been mentioned, this entire House agreed on action on student loans, but we're only seeing the government now get to that, and then a little bit of understanding of something that I would like to just bring into context in terms of the spending part of what this bill addresses. Madam Speaker, I have about 2 minutes. Is that about right? 3:35. Okay, 3:35. More time than I expected. Okay. Okay. Thanks to that member. You know, there is certainly some concern when it comes to the overall spending because, you know, although there's been no question that supports have been needed, and that's why Conservatives have stepped up to the plate. You know, in fact, we have attempted to, and in some cases been successful. I'll give the government a little bit of credit. At times, there's been some successful collaboration. And there's been other times where it's been very unfortunate, the unwillingness of the government to bring forward in a fair and transparent way, and we can reference the power grab that was attempted early on in the pandemic where they wanted unlimited taxation and spending powers. Frankly, you know, rolling back 800 years of parliamentary tradition, there's been scandals that certainly we're demanding answers for and still are. We Charity, the Baylis Medical, among others, and then the prorogation, where for no other reason than the fact that the Prime Minister was trying to hide from his own mistakes, prorogue Parliament. And although they'll claim they only lost 2 days of parliamentary sitting, Canadians can see through that. When you look at the facts, it's about 35 days lost, especially when you calculate the bills that were on the order paper that had to be reintroduced and debated, many of which, even though there were issues identified, came back exactly the same. But as I come to the conclusion of my remarks here, Part 7 of this bill, where there's an increase to Canada's borrowing authority. You know, we've seen unprecedented growth in the spending of our government, and this economic statement that we'll be voting on speaks to aspects of that. According to the Parliamentary Budget Officer, by the end of fiscal 23-24, the debt capacity or the spending of the government when it comes to debt financing requirements will be $1.642 trillion. That's trillion with a T. However, I would note this. The Borrowing Authority Act, Madam Speaker, asks for 1.831. Now, there's a discrepancy there, if I'm doing math quickly in my head, of $207 billion. Now, if the government plans to spend that $207 billion, well, that's the right of the government to bring forward that legislation and that plan to suggest so. However, we've seen an unprecedented lack of transparency in the way that this government has operated. So to see that there is a massive capacity increase to the borrowing of not the government's money. That's one of the frustrations is whenever I hear whether it's the Prime Minister or a minister or any level of government say, oh, well, it's our money, spend. Well, that's frankly false. 100% categorically false. It's taxpayers' money, hardworking taxpayers that spend that. So I believe that there are serious questions, Madam Speaker, that need to be answered, whether it's regards to C-14 or the overall circumstances that we find ourselves in. And I look forward to questions. Thank you.
And comments, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank the member for his comments. I will point out before I get to my question on the issue of government expenditures, many of the investments that we have made, though they are expensive, will actually reduce the overall cost to government, because the cost of not supporting households and businesses to get them through this pandemic is far greater than the cost of making sure that they can survive and preventing that economic scarring. The thesis that he led off with was effectively that the government shouldn't just be spending money, but figuring out whether there is value received for that money. I want to talk about one specific program. His leader has repeatedly criticized in public the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, or CERB as it's become known to Canadians, that has now reached nearly 9 million Canadians to help them keep a roof over their head and food on the table for their families. Does he agree with his leader that this program was completely screwed up, or does he believe that the Canada Emergency Response Benefit actually provided value for the money to Canadian households?
The Honourable Member for Battle River Crowfoot.
Madam Speaker, there it is. Putting words in the mouth of what the Leader of the Opposition's talked about. Now, let me clarify for the member. In fact, Conservatives were there in the beginning when CERB was first introduced, understanding that the unprecedented circumstances that we all faced needed unprecedented action. So Conservatives were there, and not only were Conservatives there, we were doing everything we could to be collaborative in the process to ensure that it would be effective, to ensure that it was being spent in the right way, to ensure that the formulas that were being used would both balance accountability with the need to get dollars in the pockets of Canadians. In fact, we made further suggestions about the way that that could have been administered, which the government decided not to follow, which is their right, but likewise, they need to accept the consequences of some of those decisions and now the challenges that have come out as a result. Madam Speaker, Canadians needed support, yes. But the question of effectiveness when it comes to this program in particular, they are not immune from that criticism. In fact, they are responsible for many of the challenges that are faced with it.
The Honourable Member for Berthier-Mascagnon-Jay. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I'd like to thank my colleague for his speech. In Bill C-14, there are interesting points. However, there are some disappointments, particularly, my colleague underscored the fact that the government hasn't had a budget for quite some time, and this government really cares about its image. They talked about credits for sectors that are affected, but look at the mis-eligibility criteria. There's a lovely announcement here, but it won't really help because most won't be eligible. There's disappointments also because there's still business owners who don't have any help for rent and farmers who've had many expenses and they're not eligible for support either. I'd like to hear what my colleague has to say about this bill, which has many holes. Thank you.
Crowfoot.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And I agree with the member. There are many holes that exist. Some of them attempts, and some. In fact, there's been a few times where the government made an announcement, took way longer than many would suggest was necessary in terms of implementation of that announcement, then screwed it up the first time, and then had to come back to the drawing table. And for sure, in one case off the top of my mind, but I'm sure there's others, screwed it up a second time, and now are having to return to Parliament to see fixes on that again. You know, that's the problem here. Had the Liberals been more collaborative in the process, listened to some of the constructive criticism that existed, listened to premiers when they affected sectors, we would be in a very, very different situation today than we find ourselves in, and certainly the dollars would have been spent more effectively.
Time for a very brief question. The Honourable Member for South Okanagan, West Kootenay.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and I will be brief. I just want to ask the member whether he would support, as 60% of Conservative supporters across Canada do, according to polls, the idea of a wealth tax on the very people that can afford to pay for the situation we find ourselves in instead of ordinary Canadians. So would he be in favor of that wealth tax?
The honourable member for Battle River Crowfoot, a brief answer, please.
So look, Madam Speaker, I won't take any lessons from a member of the NDP who wants to shut down wealth creation in this country, such as the pipeline. And I know he asked a whole bunch of questions on Monday about how you should simply, with a snap of your fingers, force thousands of people out of work and shut down an entire sector. And somehow, miraculously, maybe with some unicorn dust and a few other things, there will be sectors that simply replace themselves, when the reality is Canada has a world-class energy sector that needs to be respected and is a big part of the way that we can dig ourselves out of the economic challenges we find ourselves in. So I'd ask that member very specifically that he has to look at the things.
I'm sorry, the honourable member, when I say brief, I would just ask that people try to keep it as briefly as possible. I did allow for extra time, but I do have to cut the clock at some point to make sure that everybody gets a chance to